So the works from Henry James that I'm going to be focusing on, the more popular ones are The Portrait of a Lady and Daisy Miller, and then I'm also going to look at The Real Thing, which is one of his short stories, and then one of his really long short stories, The Coxon Fund. And The Coxon Fund is especially interesting because when I was reading his notebooks, as one does, he was talking about how he wanted to make the Coxon Fund a much bigger work than his publishers were allowing him to make it. They said, the next thing that you're gonna write is gonna be 20,000 words. And he's like, I don't know how I'm gonna fit it in there. So what he says is the formula for the presentation of it in 20,000 words is to make it an impression, as one of Sargent's pictures is an impression. The Sargent that he's referring to is John Singer Sargent, who was an impressionist painter that Henry James met about 10 years before he wrote this in his notebook. And actually, this copy of The American that I have has one of Sargent's paintings on it, which is kind of cool. Just like you have the impressionist painters trying to paint a sunset before it fades, you have Henry James trying to condense this story that he thinks needs a lot more space into a smaller canvas. And so what you get are these really quick brushstrokes that you see, these quick instantaneous impressions of the character of Mr. Saltram, and he has very blurry edges as a character, which we'll get into later. Also, Mr. Saltram is directly compared to a painting, which we'll also see later. It's almost as if you're not watching Mr. Saltram across time, because you really don't get to see that much of him. Instead, it's like you're reading a commentary on a painting. So it's taking the little brushstrokes of Mr. Saltram's portrait and trying to examine each one and then fill it out in a movement of time. So the thing is, when Henry James says here that he is trying to make this particular work as an impressionist painter would make an impressionist painting, what he goes on to say is that he realizes that all he's doing is returning to his style that he was comfortable with and is used in all of his works anyway. So he says, that is, I must do it from my own point of view, that of an imagined observer, participator, chronicler. I must picture it, summarize it, impressionize it in a word, compress and confine it by making it a picture of what I see. That has the great advantage of rendering the picture of Saltram an implied and suggested thing. I should probably have had, after all, to have come to this. I should have found it impossible to content myself with any literal record, anything merely narrative. A strong subject, a rich subject summarized, that is my indispensable formula and memento. What that says to us as readers is that this idea of capturing the impressionist spirit in his works is not just for the Coxon Fund, but for every single one of his works, especially since he had written The Portrait of a Lady, Daisy Miller, The American, and other works during the time that the impressionist movement was happening, from 1867 to 1886. So the task here is to look at a few of his works and see how he represents several of his characters as literal paintings, and then how he also uses this idea of blurry edges to characterize his characters. First of all, starting with Daisy Miller. So basically this story is Winterbourne, who is one of many of Daisy Miller's admirers, tries to find out whether she truly is as innocent as she seems. So Daisy Miller is depicted as a literal painting to begin with. A tourist is talking with Winterbourne in an art gallery which is a very common motif in Henry James' works. And after they discuss a particular painting, the tourist says, "I had the pleasure of contemplating a picture of a different kind, that pretty American girl whom you pointed out to me last week." In this scene, Daisy Miller is being contemplated as if she is a painting. And when you're looking at a painting, the artist is not there to defend themselves. And so you very much get this effect in a lot of Henry James works, that the characters are not able to defend themselves, and it's just a bunch of debates of other people like looking at the painting and being like, well, I see this or I see that. Ironically, you get a very shallow kind of portrait of his characters, but they're also very rich and vivid and complex at the same time, just like a painting is. So it's almost as if they're a flat canvas with so much dynamic movement happening there. But you never get really beyond the surface, except for in one of the works we're going to look at in a minute. The kind of debate that's going on here about Daisy Miller is, again, is she really innocent or not? At first, when Winterbourne encounters Daisy, he sees her as innocent, just like her name, Daisy. And I think it's also interesting that Daisy is not her real name. It says, Miss Daisy Miller looked extremely innocent in the beginning. And then in chapter 2, when Winterbourne and Daisy were going to go visit this castle, and then Daisy's like, nope, that's not happening. She says to him, I hope you are disappointed or disgusted or something. And I remember when I was reading this, when I read that, like, I did not like her as a character at this point, because I'm like, I don't care whether she's as innocent as a Daisy. The fact is she's being extremely rude, and like, I did not like her at this point. But true to Henry James' style, when you go a couple chapters later in chapter 4, when she gets to speak for herself finally, Winterbourne is mad at her and is saying that what she's doing is basically scandalous. And it's that because she is hanging out, she is being seen alone with a man, and she is unmarried. And she says, it seems to me much more proper in young unmarried women than in old married ones. That was where my opinion kind of changed of her. It wasn't like an entire pendulum swing, but she has a point, because, okay, maybe what she's doing is not the most innocent, nice thing she could do, but she points out, okay, all the people who are judging me for this have flaws themselves. Is this character really good, or is this character really bad? You can't really define the boundaries very well. So this next one that we're going to be talking about is The Real Thing, which holds a very special place in my heart, because this is the very first thing that I ever read from Henry James. So in this story, the narrator is making illustrations for a novel, and these rich people who have fallen on hard times financially are looking for employment basically anywhere they can find it. The story is about the contrast between the narrator when he is sketching the rich people and then when he is sketching the poorer people, and the outcome and what the art looks like. Particularly when it comes to the rich people, they are known as Major and Mrs. Monarch. They're never given an actual name, and so it gives them the surface level quality. It's like you never get to see who they actually are, just everyone else's interpretation of them. And in the story, Jack Hawley is one of the narrator's friends. The narrator says he's not the best painter, but when he looks at the sketches that the narrator has done, he is able to give really good feedback, even if it is extremely blunt. When he sees the sketches that the narrator had done of the rich people, he says, well, I never want to meet these people. I mean, look at the paintings, it's ridiculous. He looks like he's 7 feet tall, like, what are you doing? Then when he finally gets to meet them, he stays far away and is even more convinced that his opinion of their ridiculousness is correct. The reason why they look so ridiculous in the paintings is because they only have one posture. They are used to sitting for portraits and looking all straight and tall, but the poorer people he can mold them into anything he wants in the painting. And just like with Daisy Miller, he does add layers of complexity onto them to make them a little bit more than surface level, but it's really just adding different colors to the canvas and doesn't really get beyond that. But the richness and the beauty of the story is in the narrator and his interpretation of the subjects. The subject, again, like Monet was saying, that he wants to recreate what lies between the scene and himself. Here, it's more about the narrator's interpretation of these people than the actual people. So it suffices to have them just as a flat painting for the illustrator to add his interpretation onto. So again, the blurry edges that you see in this particular work are the rich people, Major and Mrs. Monarch. At first they seem like they're kind of like, you know, very kind of snobbish and like condescending. But as you continue to go on in the narrative, sometimes you wonder, is it really because they genuinely have a character that is like, thinks they're better than everyone else, or is it just that's what they're accustomed to? Because you see them beginning to change throughout the stories, they become more desperate, but you don't really ever know what their true character is. You see this debate back and forth. It's like, okay, well, they're not very good at modeling because they only have one pose, whereas the poorer people they can become anything, and they're like, I guess, not so uptight, so they can like, they just have fun with it and can become any personality the artist needs them to be. And so then you also get the idea of like, okay, well, they've basically had it made their entire lives, and it is quite evident, but how far does that really go into their character? You don't really know, because when it comes to fixing one of the other model's hair, Mrs. Monarch is actually very good at it. And so you do see, it's like, okay, maybe there's more to them than just the fact that they're rich people. You know, they really do have a heart, even though you don't really get to see it all that much in the story. The main interest of this one is that it's one of those examples of how Henry James uses the art world, again, to create this feeling of time just stopping, like it does in a painting, while in the fluid movement of words across time. But again, it shows that she's almost studying her admirers as if they're just shallow paintings, and she's having to put her intelligence and her taste into interpreting them instead of seeing them as human beings with beating hearts. So this eventually, spoiler alert, will cause her to marry somebody who is very much a painting. It's like all he has is good taste, but there's nothing beyond that. It's just a shallow, flat canvas.